Why Britain's Cromwell tank failed what America's Sherman did for 2,000 miles, without braking. August 4, 1943. Bovington Camp, Dorset, England. The morning fog clung to the land as Major General A.C. Richardson's pen moved steadily across the classified document marked Most Secret in bold red letters. Each stroke recorded observations that would expose one of Britain's most embarrassing wartime failures. "The reliability test begins today," he wrote. "Three nations' machines will travel 2,000 miles across Britain. Only one will prove worthy of modern warfare." The weight of that prediction would become clear in the weeks ahead. Through the morning mist that shrouded the camp, 11 tanks stood in formation on the parade ground, engines idling with varying degrees of confidence. The mechanical symphony was telling. 3 American M4A2 Shermans, powered by General Motors' twin diesel engines, purred with industrial smoothness. 3 M4A4 Shermans with Chrysler multibank petrol engines rumbled with reliable consistency. 3 British Cromwell Mark I cruiser tanks with the new Rolls-Royce Meteor engine growled with impressive power but concerning roughness. 2 Cromwell Mark III tanks, supposedly improved variants of the design, added their voices to the mechanical chorus. 3 Centaur Mark I tanks, powered by the aging Liberty engine that had proven inadequate in earlier cruiser designs, coughed and sputtered ominously. The crews climbed aboard their assigned vehicles, unaware they were about to participate in what historians would later call the most definitive reliability comparison of World War II armored vehicles. What none of them knew on that foggy morning was that this exercise would reveal a profound truth about industrial philosophy and military procurement. The Americans had built for reliability in mass production, accepting adequate performance if it meant the tank would work consistently. The British had designed for speed and theoretical superiority, prioritizing impressive specifications over mundane dependability. Over the next 7 weeks, Exercise Dracula would demonstrate which approach actually won wars. The numbers would be devastating for British pride. The implications would reshape British armored doctrine for the remainder of the conflict. And the lesson would echo through decades of military procurement decisions, influencing how democratic nations thought about weapons development long after the last gun of World War II fell silent. The story of Exercise Dracula begins not in the quiet English countryside, but in the scorching deserts of North Africa, where British tank crews had faced a devastating crisis of confidence. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, British cruiser tanks had earned a reputation for mechanical failure at precisely the worst possible moments. The Crusader tank, despite its theoretically impressive speed of 26 miles per hour that should have given British forces a mobility advantage, spent more time broken down beside desert tracks than it did advancing toward enemy positions. Oil leaks plagued the Liberty engine that powered most British cruisers. The cooling systems, designed in temperate England, failed catastrophically in the African heat where temperatures inside a tank could exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Transmissions shattered under the stress of sandy terrain and constant maneuvering. Suspensions broke on rough ground. Electrical systems failed in dusty conditions. Tank crews learned to carry extensive spare parts as standard practice and to expect frequent, time-consuming breakdowns that left them vulnerable and frustrated. British tankers watched with growing frustration as American-supplied M4 Sherman tanks, arriving through the Lend-Lease program that was shipping military equipment to Britain in growing quantities, operated with far greater reliability than anything British industry was producing. The Shermans lacked the theoretical speed of British cruisers on paper, running at about 25 miles per hour maximum compared to the Crusaders' 26 or the Cromwell's eventual 40 miles per hour. But the Shermans started reliably every morning, a detail that crews of British tanks could never take for granted. They ran all day without breaking down. They required less maintenance time, freeing crews for other duties. They broke down less frequently, meaning more tanks were available for operations at any given moment. Most importantly, they were simply there when needed for combat operations, ready to fight rather than being repaired behind the lines. General Bernard Montgomery himself, commander of British forces in North Africa and later in Northwest Europe, noted in his private correspondence that American tanks could be depended upon to work, while British designs remained temperamental at best and dangerously unreliable at worst. The British War Office in London faced a dilemma that cut to the heart of British industrial pride. Years of tank development, decades of engineering expertise, and the concentrated effort of Britain's finest designers had produced a series of disappointing designs that failed in combat. The Covenanter, introduced with great fanfare in 1941 as the next generation of cruiser tank, was so unreliable that it never saw combat deployment. Despite more than 1,700 units being manufactured at considerable expense, the cooling system failed so regularly that the tank was effectively unusable in any climate warmer than a British autumn. The Crusader that followed and did see extensive combat proved marginally better, but still suffered chronic mechanical problems that limited its effectiveness and frustrated crews who needed equipment they could trust. The Cavalier, designated A24 Cromwell Mark I in early development before the naming conventions were revised, inherited the same flawed Liberty engine and was quickly relegated to training duties after trials showed it was no more reliable than its predecessors. Britain desperately needed a cruiser tank that actually worked consistently in combat conditions. The solution appeared to come from Rolls-Royce, the company that had built its reputation on producing the finest automobiles in the world and had successfully transitioned to aircraft engine production. Engineer W. A. Robotham, a senior Rolls-Royce designer with extensive experience in high-performance engines, had brilliantly converted the famous Merlin aircraft engine, which powered the Spitfire and Hurricane fighters that had won the Battle of Britain, into a tank engine called the Meteor. This 600-horsepower V12 power plant promised the combination of power and reliability that had been missing from every British tank design of the war. The Merlin had proven itself supremely reliable in aircraft, running for hundreds of hours between major servicing. Surely, British engineers reasoned, that same reliability would translate to tank use. The engine would be installed in the A27M hull, creating what was officially designated tank, cruiser, Mark VIII Cromwell. Early tests showed impressive performance that exceeded expectations. The Cromwell achieved speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour on test tracks, making it the fastest British tank of the war and one of the fastest tanks fielded by any nation. Production began in January 1943 at multiple facilities across Britain's industrial heartland: Leland Motors in Lancashire, Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, Metro Camel, English Electric, and other manufacturers told up for mass production of what everyone hoped would finally be Britain's answer to German armoured superiority. By summer 1943, hundreds of Cromwell tanks were rolling off assembly lines. Production was ramping up toward planned totals that would equip entire armoured divisions. The War Office made plans to equip British armoured divisions with this new cruiser tank, finally ending the embarrassing dependence on American-supplied vehicles. British tank crews would have a homegrown machine that combined impressive speed, adequate firepower from a 75mm gun, reasonable armor protection, and hopefully the reliability that had eluded every previous design. But doubts lingered among those who worked most closely with the tanks. Early field reports from training units receiving the first production Cromwells mentioned troubling problems that sounded distressingly familiar. Oil leaks around the engine compartment created fire hazards and left trails that enemy reconnaissance aircraft could spot from miles away. Brake failures during extended operations left tanks unable to control their impressive speed on downhill slopes. Clutch problems left tanks immobilized in the field during training exercises, raising questions about what would happen during combat stress. Steering difficulties that crews described as unreliable and concerning, with tanks sometimes refusing to respond properly to driver inputs. These issues appeared during training under controlled conditions with ample spare parts and skilled mechanics available. What would happen during the stress of prolonged combat operations far from supply depots? The War Office needed definitive answers before committing fully to the Cromwell as Britain's primary cruiser tank and phasing out reliance on American equipment. In July 1943, senior British military leadership made the decision to conduct a comprehensive reliability test that would settle the question once and for all. Exercise Dracula would pit the new British tanks directly against the American Shermans that had proven themselves in North Africa, Sicily, and increasingly in Italy, where Allied forces had invaded in July. The test would be a 2,000-mile endurance trial across the length and breadth of Britain, simulating the demands of a prolonged campaign. The exercise would simulate actual combat campaign conditions as closely as possible short of enemy fire. Tanks would move long distances over varied terrain, including paved roads, dirt tracks, and cross-country movement. They would operate in all weather conditions that a British autumn could provide, which meant rain, mud, and temperature variations. Vehicles would be maintained under field conditions using standard procedures and the tools that would be available to units in combat, without access to specialized factory equipment or expert civilian technicians. The results would determine whether the Cromwell was ready for frontline service or needed additional development time that Britain could ill afford as the war entered its fifth year. The test parameters were established with meticulous care to ensure fairness and objectivity. All tanks would be standard production models pulled directly from assembly lines, not specially prepared vehicles or hand-built prototypes that might not represent what units would actually receive. Crews would be experienced British personnel who had trained on both British and American equipment, eliminating crew training and familiarity as variables that might skew results. Maintenance would be performed under field conditions using only the standard procedures outlined in field manuals and only the tools that would be available to forward units, without resort to specialized equipment or civilian factory technicians. The tanks would travel identical routes, face exactly the same challenges, and operate under the same constraints. Every defect, no matter how minor, would be meticulously recorded. Every hour of maintenance would be logged and analyzed. The test would provide objective data on which tanks could genuinely be trusted in combat operations, where reliability could mean the difference between victory and defeat. 3 types of tanks would compete in this comprehensive evaluation. The Sherman M4A2 used General Motors twin diesel engines, a configuration specifically chosen by American designers for exceptional reliability and fuel efficiency. The Sherman M4A4 employed the Chrysler A57 multibank engine, an ingenious design that was essentially 5 automobile engines joined together into a single power plant. Both Sherman variants had already proven themselves in combat across North Africa, Sicily, and increasingly in Italy. American crews trusted them. British crews, who had transitioned from British tanks to Shermans, praised them. The Cromwell Mark I and Mark III represented Britain's latest cruiser tank technology. Powered by the Meteor engine adapted from the Merlin aircraft engine and equipped with 75mm guns that used the same ammunition as the Sherman for logistical simplicity. The Centaur Mark I, powered by the outdated Liberty engine that had failed in previous designs, served primarily as a baseline comparison, representing the older British tank technology that the Cromwell was meant to surpass. The first 10 days of exercise Dracula focused entirely on preparation at Bovington Camp, the British Army's primary armoured training facility. Mechanics inspected each tank thoroughly, going through systems methodically to ensure all vehicles started the test in proper mechanical condition. Any pre-existing defects were identified and corrected. Crews familiarized themselves with their assigned vehicles, learning the particular characteristics and quirks of each tank. Officers established detailed maintenance protocols and meticulous recording procedures that would be followed throughout the exercise. Everything was documented in careful detail, creating a comprehensive baseline from which to measure subsequent performance. The competitive spirit between crews grew evident as training days progressed. British crews wanted desperately for their homegrown tanks to triumph over the American machines, to vindicate years of British tank development efforts. Sherman crews, many of whom had combat experience with the type in North Africa and could compare it favorably to the British tanks they had used earlier, expressed quiet confidence that experience had taught them was well justified. August 15, 1943. The exercise proper began in earnest. 11 tanks departed Bovington Camp in the early morning light, heading north on a carefully planned route that would take them through the heart of England, up into Scotland, across to Wales, and eventually back to Dorset. The journey would cover approximately 2,000 miles over the next 4 weeks, with planned stops at various military installations along the route. Each day would bring demanding road marches on paved highways, cross-country movement through farmers' fields and mud, and simulated tactical operations that tested the tanks under conditions approximating combat stress. Tanks would operate in whatever weather conditions a British autumn provided, which meant rain, mud, cold nights, and occasionally clear days. Maintenance would be performed each evening at designated stops, with all repair work and defects meticulously recorded by dedicated observers who accompanied the formation. The first problems appeared within hours of departure, visible to anyone watching carefully. One Centaur began trailing smoke from the engine compartment before the formation had covered 10 miles. The aging Liberty engine was already showing signs of stress under sustained operation. By the first evening halt at a training area north of London, that same Centaur had developed a significant oil leak that required 2 hours of emergency maintenance by the crew and attached mechanics. A Cromwell experienced worrying brake problems during descent of a long hill on the route north, forcing the driver to use low gears to control speed because the brakes were fading dangerously. The Shermans reached the first stop without any incidents requiring attention beyond routine maintenance, their crews completing standard evening checks and preparing for the next day's movement. The observers noted everything in growing detail, accumulating data that would soon reveal clear patterns. By the end of the first week, unmistakable patterns had emerged that would persist throughout the exercise. The Centaur tanks consistently arrived last at evening halts, often hours behind schedule. Their crews were exhausted from nursing broken vehicles. Their mechanical problems required intensive emergency repairs late into the night. Oil leaks plagued the Liberty engines, leaving trails on roads and causing chronic oil pressure problems. The cooling system struggled to manage engine heat during sustained operations, leading to overheating that forced frequent stops. Clutches slipped under load, making gear changes difficult and sometimes impossible. One Centaur required 8 hours of maintenance in a single evening. The crew worked by flashlight, exhausting themselves to keep the tank operational enough to continue the exercise. The competitive spirit that had marked the exercise's start had completely disappeared among Centaur crews, replaced by grim determination to simply complete each day's movement without being evacuated from the exercise entirely. The Cromwell tanks showed distinctly better performance than the failing Centaurs, but still fell far short of the hopes and expectations British designers had invested in them. Oil leaks developed around engine seals with distressing regularity, requiring constant attention from crews who were supposed to be resting. The brake systems proved inadequate for a tank capable of 40 miles per hour, with dangerous brake fade occurring on long descents that left drivers struggling to control their vehicles. Clutch failures became increasingly common as the exercise progressed, traced by mechanics to inadequate design for handling the Meteor engine's substantial torque characteristics. Steering problems persisted despite modifications, with crews reporting difficulty maintaining direction during cross-country movement through rough terrain. Most troublingly for British military leadership reviewing the reports, these were not newly discovered problems. Observers noted explicitly that the defects appearing in Exercise Dracula were well-known issues that had appeared in earlier testing and should have been corrected during development before production began. The Sherman tanks, by contrast, operated with remarkable mechanical consistency that impressed even skeptical British crews. They started reliably every morning, a simple detail that crews of British tanks could absolutely not take for granted after years of temperamental equipment. They maintained scheduled march speeds without the mechanical drama that characterized British tank operations. When maintenance was required, which was infrequent, it was routine and predictable rather than emergency repairs that consumed entire evenings. The diesel-powered M4A2 proved particularly reliable and robust, with one experienced crew commenting that the engine seemed nearly unbreakable even under sustained hard use. The multibank M4A4 required slightly more attention due to its more complex design, but still vastly outperformed the British tanks in every reliability metric. American engineering philosophy, of simplicity and reliability, prioritizing dependable operation over impressive specifications, was demonstrating clear and undeniable superiority over the British pursuit of speed and theoretical performance. Captain Priestley of the Coldstream Guards, serving as second in command of the exercise, documented the often overlooked human cost of mechanical unreliability. Cromwell crews, he noted in his daily reports, should theoretically have had the easiest time, as their tanks were fastest and on paper should arrive first at each evening halt. In practice, however, one or two Cromwells routinely arrived late at night due to breakdowns en route and time-consuming repairs. This meant late meals for crews who needed rest. Guides left waiting for hours in the cold and darkness. Fuel trucks kept standing by when they were needed elsewhere. Loss of sleep for numerous personnel beyond just the tank crews themselves. The ripple effects of unreliability extended far beyond the broken tank itself, affecting the entire unit's efficiency and morale in ways that were difficult to quantify but undeniably significant. The maintenance statistics being compiled told a devastating story that would shake British confidence in their tank program. By early September, as the exercise approached its conclusion after covering nearly the full 2,000 miles, the numbers made brutally clear the vast gulf between American and British tank reliability. Observers had meticulously tracked every defect, every hour of maintenance, every failure of every system on every tank. The data was compiled into comprehensive tables and detailed charts that would become part of the most secret final report, circulated only to the highest levels of British military and political leadership. The implications were profound and deeply embarrassing for British tank production efforts that had consumed enormous resources. The three Sherman M4A2 tanks covered 13,986 miles combined, an impressive total that exceeded the planned distance. Because these tanks served as the pace setters for the formation, they experienced 199 defects total across all three vehicles during the entire exercise, an average of 66 defects per tank. Maintenance required 420 hours of specialist fitter attention across all three tanks, an average of 140 hours per tank for the entire exercise. This corresponded to just 0.03 hours of maintenance per mile driven, or roughly 2 minutes of maintenance for every mile traveled. The tanks were nearly maintenance-free by the standards of armored vehicles, requiring only routine servicing and occasional minor repairs that could be completed quickly by crews. The reliability was extraordinary for complex machines operating under difficult conditions far from factory support. The three Sherman M4A4 tanks, with their more complex multibank engines that combined 5 automobile power plants, showed slightly higher maintenance needs but still impressive reliability that exceeded British equipment. Their statistics mirrored the diesel variants closely enough that the official report considered all 6 American tanks together as demonstrating comprehensively superior reliability. The Sherman tanks proved decisively that American engineering philosophy worked in practice. Simple, robust designs with adequate rather than exceptional performance characteristics created tanks that actually operated consistently when needed. Theory meant nothing if the tank sat broken down beside the road while the enemy advanced. The 5 Cromwell tanks, by stark comparison, covered 11,582 miles combined while experiencing 367 defects total, significantly more problems despite covering less distance. Specialist fitters worked 814 hours keeping the Cromwells operational, nearly double the Sherman requirement. This corresponded to 0.07 hours of maintenance per mile, or more than double the Sherman requirement for the same distance traveled. Every mile driven in a Cromwell meant more than 4 minutes of maintenance compared to just 2 minutes for a Sherman. The difference between 0.03 and 0.07 hours per mile sounds small and almost negligible in abstract statistical terms, but it translated directly to Cromwell tanks requiring more than twice as much maintenance time as Shermans for equivalent distance traveled. In campaign conditions, this meant Sherman-equipped units could advance farther and faster because they spent less time repairing broken tanks. The 3 Centaur tanks performed even worse than the disappointing Cromwells, confirming what many had suspected. They covered only 8,492 miles combined due to constant breakdowns that often left tanks immobilized for extended periods. The Centaurs experienced 297 defects total and required 742 hours of maintenance, approaching the Cromwell total despite covering far less distance. This worked out to 0.087 hours per mile, nearly 3 times the Sherman requirement, and making the Centaur the worst performer in every category. The Liberty engine simply could not handle the demands placed upon it by a modern tank. The Centaur was clearly a failed design that had been kept in production only to maintain factory output while Meteor engine production ramped up to adequate levels. The exercise proved definitively what many had suspected, that the Centaur should never have been built and represented a significant waste of scarce industrial resources. Major General Richardson's final report pulled absolutely no punches about British failures. The simplicity and reliability of the American machines, in contrast with the British production, is to me the chief lesson of Dracula, he wrote in clear, unambiguous language. The Cromwell could no doubt be made into an equally good fighting vehicle, but the redesigning necessary should have as its chief object simplicity, which in turn will bring reliability. The report noted with clinical precision that an equipment commander with Shermans could be genuinely confident of taking 99% of his vehicles into battle, at least during the first 2,000 miles of their operational life. A commander equipped with Cromwells or Centaurs, by stark contrast, would be in a continuous state of anxiety about whether enough tanks would actually reach the battlefield to carry out the normal tasks expected of his unit. The observers added crucial context that made the British performance look even worse. Exercise Dracula was run under conditions very favorable to the machines, particularly the less reliable ones, the report stated. Frankly, long mileages were covered, but the squadron always reached harbor in time to carry out maintenance in daylight with adequate facilities. Even so, the British machines were kept on the road only through much hard work by dedicated crews and mechanics. Such favorable conditions would never be encountered during actual combat operations. Less favorable conditions, such as those encountered in sustained campaign fighting, would react most unfavorably on reliability and battleworthiness. In other words, the Cromwell's already poor performance in this controlled exercise would certainly be even worse in actual combat conditions with enemy pressure, limited time for maintenance, and difficult supply conditions. One British observer, Alec Richardson of the British Tank Mission, who had been monitoring separate American testing of British tanks, wrote a scathingly candid assessment in October 1943. "These tanks have made us a laughingstock out here," he wrote, regarding Cromwell and Centaur tanks that had been sent to American proving grounds for separate evaluation. "The Cromwell has had a variety of troubles that keep appearing. The Americans are politely indifferent to what happens to them, which is perhaps worse than open criticism. The Rolls-Royce representative is most unhappy and wants them withdrawn as soon as possible to avoid further embarrassment. We are undoubtedly the world's worst salesman when it comes to tanks." His recommendations were stark and unmistakable: send no more British tanks to America until they are genuinely reliable and can compete with comparable American equipment. "We must make a first-class cruiser and light tank at home, however long it takes us to get the design right. We must regain our prestige and reputation for quality engineering." The causes of Cromwell unreliability were well understood by British engineers who analyzed the exercise Dracula results. The Meteor engine, though powerful and relatively reliable compared to the disastrous Liberty engine, was fundamentally an aircraft engine that had been adapted for tank use. Aircraft engines operate at relatively constant speeds under fairly steady conditions and do not experience the reverse torque and constant speed changes that tank engines must endure during tactical maneuvers. The adaptation from aircraft to tank was imperfect and showed in reliability problems. Oil seals designed for aircraft use leaked under the different pressure conditions of tank operation. The cooling system, perfectly adequate for an aircraft where cooling air flows constantly, struggled with the confined space and highly varied cooling demands of a tank installation. The engine was magnificent in principle and impressive on paper, but problematic in actual field execution. The transmission and running gear problems stemmed directly from inadequate development time before production began. The Merritt-Brown gearbox was sophisticated and provided good performance characteristics, but was also complex with more potential points of failure than simpler American transmission designs. The brakes were clearly undersized for a tank capable of 40 miles per hour, leading to dangerous brake fade during sustained use on long descents. The clutch was simply not robust enough to handle the Meteor's substantial torque output reliably. The suspension, largely inherited from earlier cruiser tank designs, was stressed well beyond its original design limits by the Cromwell's increased weight and high-speed capability. Each system worked adequately in isolation during static testing, but proved vulnerable and prone to failure when stressed by actual sustained operational conditions. The fundamental problem was philosophical and cut to the heart of British versus American engineering approaches. British tank design prioritized speed and firepower above all else, viewing reliability as a secondary concern that could be addressed through skilled maintenance by trained crews. This philosophy worked adequately in peacetime conditions when tanks operated from established bases with ample logistical support and specialized maintenance facilities readily available. It failed catastrophically in wartime conditions when tanks had to operate far from rear area depots with severely limited spare parts, under continuous operational stress without adequate rest periods. The Americans, by deliberate contrast, designed for reliability first, consciously accepting modest performance specifications if it meant the tank would operate consistently when needed. Their philosophy proved decisively superior in practice when tested under realistic operational conditions. Exercise Dracula forced a brutal reassessment of British tank production priorities and development philosophy. The Cromwell underwent extensive modifications based directly on exercise findings. Engineers addressed the oil leak problems with improved seals designed specifically for tank operating conditions. The brake system was completely redesigned with substantially larger capacity components. Clutch components were significantly strengthened to handle the engine's torque reliably. The suspension received detailed attention to reduce the chronic failure problems. These improvements took many months to implement properly and required significant changes to established production processes at multiple factories. The final production specification for what Leland Motors called the Battle Cromwell was not finalized until February 1944, incorporating numerous minor changes to the basic design alongside the major reliability improvements. A second round of comprehensive testing in November 1943 showed marked improvement in Cromwell performance. The modified Cromwells performed significantly better than the August versions, though still not quite matching Sherman reliability benchmarks in all categories. The Centaur, by stark contrast, showed virtually no improvement despite modification attempts and was effectively written off for combat use. The Liberty engine simply lacked adequate power for the tank's weight, and no amount of modification could overcome that fundamental design flaw. Most Centaurs were relegated to training roles where their unreliability was less critical or converted to specialized vehicles like armored recovery vehicles, artillery observation posts, or the Centaur dozer with its turret removed and bulldozer blade added for engineering tasks. The Cromwell eventually entered frontline combat service in June 1944, equipping the armored reconnaissance regiments of several British and Polish divisions for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. In combat operations, the tank proved genuinely fast and maneuverable with an admirably low profile that made it difficult for enemy gunners to spot and engage at range. Crews praised these characteristics enthusiastically. However, reliability remained a persistent concern compared to Sherman-equipped units. Cromwells required more maintenance time per day of operations. Units carried more spare parts to handle the higher failure rates. The 75mm gun, identical to the Sherman's main weapon and using the same ammunition for logistical simplicity, provided adequate firepower against most German tanks but struggled notably against the thick armor of Tigers and Panthers. Speed and stealth became the Cromwell's main combat advantages, allowing it to avoid prolonged engagements where its gun and armor were inadequate. The broader lesson of Exercise Dracula extended far beyond narrow tank design questions. The test demonstrated comprehensively that reliability was not merely a convenience or desirable characteristic, but rather a fundamental military capability that determined operational effectiveness. An unreliable tank might as well not exist if it cannot reach the battlefield when needed for combat operations. A moderately performing tank that operates consistently and predictably beats a theoretically high-performing tank that breaks down regularly and unpredictably in every practical measure of combat effectiveness. The Americans understood this essential truth intuitively and designed their equipment accordingly from the start. The British, steeped in long traditions of engineering excellence and cutting-edge performance, had to learn this hard lesson through the embarrassing public failure of Exercise Dracula. The Sherman tank that so decisively outperformed the Cromwell in Exercise Dracula was itself far from perfect in many respects. Its armor was demonstrably inadequate against German Panther and Tiger tanks armed with high-velocity guns. The 75mm gun lacked sufficient penetrating power against heavy armor at combat ranges. Crews nicknamed it a Ronson after the popular cigarette lighter brand because it lights up the first time, every time, referring to the tank's unfortunate tendency to catch fire rapidly when penetrated by enemy shells. Polish soldiers serving with British forces called it grimly the burning grave. These were serious, deadly flaws that cost many lives. Yet, the Sherman remained in full production and frontline service throughout the war and continued serving long after, precisely because it worked reliably. The Sherman succeeded not through superior combat performance in tank versus tank engagements, but through superior reliability and producibility that allowed it to be everywhere in overwhelming numbers. American factories built a staggering 49,324 Shermans between 1942 and 1946, a production feat unmatched by any other Western tank design. The tank could be manufactured quickly and efficiently by factories across America. It could be shipped overseas efficiently aboard the Liberty ships that formed the backbone of Allied logistics. It could be maintained in the field effectively with the tools and skills available to ordinary units. When a Sherman was destroyed or damaged in combat, another appeared to replace it within days, or sometimes hours. Tank recovery and repair units returned damaged vehicles to service quickly, often within 24 hours of a tank being hit. This comprehensive industrial and logistical approach to armored warfare proved immeasurably more valuable than any amount of technical sophistication in individual tank design. The production numbers tell a compelling story about industrial philosophy and strategic priorities. Germany built approximately 6,000 Panther tanks and 1,300 Tiger tanks during the entire war, vehicles that were technically superior to the Sherman in both armor protection and firepower. But German tanks were severely over-engineered with unnecessarily tight tolerances, difficult and time-consuming to produce, and intensive to maintain under field conditions. They required specialized parts manufactured at specific factories. They needed skilled mechanics with extensive training. They broke down frequently under the operational stress of sustained combat campaigns. A German panzer division attempting the 400-mile rapid advance across France that Allied Sherman-equipped divisions achieved routinely in summer 1944 would have left a trail of mechanically broken tanks long before reaching Paris. The French army discovered this reality after the war when they attempted using captured Panthers in service, finding them utterly unusable and unreliable compared to Lend-Lease Shermans, which remained in French military service into the 1950s. Soviet forces received 4,100 Shermans through Lend-Lease and developed a surprising affection for the American design. Soviet tank crews, accustomed to the notoriously crude T-34, which was effective but brutally uncomfortable, found the American tank luxurious in comparison. The Sherman featured rubber tracks that lasted twice as long as the T-34's steel tracks and operated much more quietly, a significant tactical advantage. The interior was substantially more spacious and comfortable for the crew. The Sherman even had padded seats, an almost unimaginable luxury in Soviet tank design philosophy that prioritized production numbers over crew comfort. Most importantly, from a Soviet perspective, the Sherman was genuinely reliable. It started when needed without the temperamental behavior of Soviet equipment. It ran without constant mechanical drama and emergency repairs. Soviet tank commander Dmitry Loza, who wrote extensively about his combat experiences, noted that damaged Shermans left unguarded, even briefly, would be stripped for parts in minutes by other Soviet crews. This was clear testament to Soviet tankers' preference for American reliability over domestic equipment. The reliability advantage extended directly to operational tempo and campaign success. Sherman-equipped divisions could advance farther and faster than their German opponents, not through superior maximum speed, but through vastly superior mechanical uptime and availability. A Sherman-equipped armored division could realistically cover 40 miles per day for weeks on end with minimal mechanical losses to breakdown. A German panzer division attempting the same operational pace would lose more tanks to mechanical breakdown than to enemy action, steadily weakening until it could no longer function effectively. This fundamental advantage meant Allied forces could exploit tactical breakthroughs, maintain operational momentum during fluid campaigns, and keep enemies constantly off balance in ways German forces simply could not match. By 1944, when the cumulative effects of years of hard campaigning had thoroughly worn down German equipment, this disparity was decisive. Historian David Fletcher, curator at the Tank Museum in Bovington and Britain's foremost expert on British armor, summed up the Sherman's essential virtue with elegant simplicity: it would always start in the morning. It would go all day without drama. This unglamorous, unexciting reliability made it the indispensable workhorse of Allied armored forces in every theater. British tankers might have personally preferred the Cromwell's impressive speed or longed for a Firefly's powerful 17-pounder gun, but they genuinely trusted the basic Sherman to run consistently day after day. American tankers complained frequently and loudly about the Sherman's obvious weaknesses against German heavy tanks, but they knew with absolute confidence it would not leave them stranded helplessly behind enemy lines due to unexpected mechanical failure. Reliability was not glamorous or exciting, but it won battles by ensuring forces arrived at the decisive point ready to fight rather than stalled beside the road making repairs. The Cromwell's story followed a different trajectory than originally envisioned. The tank entered frontline combat service too late to replace the Sherman as Britain's primary cruiser tank design. Total production of the entire A-27 series reached 4,016 tanks, of which 950 were Centaurs and 3,066 were Cromwells. This represented merely a small fraction of Sherman production, which exceeded 49,000 units from American factories. The dramatic numbers difference reflected harsh strategic realities. British industry simply could not match American production capacity while simultaneously building the Royal Navy's ships, Royal Air Force aircraft, and countless other weapons needed for multiple theaters of global war. The Cromwell equipped primarily the specialized armored reconnaissance regiments of British and Polish armored divisions, where speed and agility mattered more than sheer numbers or sustained reliability. The famous 7th Armored Division, known worldwide as the Desert Rats after their North African service, employed Cromwells extensively in reconnaissance roles. The 11th Armored Division incorporated Cromwell-equipped reconnaissance battalions that exploited the tank's speed. The Guards Armored Division used Cromwells effectively for scouting and flanking operations. The 1st Polish Armored Division received Cromwells and operated them with considerable tactical skill through Northwest Europe campaigns. In these specialized reconnaissance roles, where the mission played to the tank's strengths, the Cromwell performed quite well. The admirably low profile and impressive high speed allowed reconnaissance units to scout ahead of main forces effectively, engage targets of opportunity when advantageous, and withdraw rapidly when encountering superior enemy forces. Experienced Cromwell crews developed sophisticated tactics that systematically maximized their advantages while minimizing exposure to their weaknesses. They used speed to avoid prolonged engagements where their inadequate gun and armor would prove fatal. They employed the low profile and excellent mobility to maintain stealth, observing enemy positions without detection. They relied on superior agility to flank slower German tanks and attack vulnerable rear armor where even the 75mm gun could penetrate. The Cromwell found its tactical niche not as a main battle tank, but as a specialized reconnaissance vehicle where speed and stealth mattered more than sustained reliability or heavy firepower. After World War II ended in Europe in May 1945, the surviving Cromwells remained in British military service well into the 1950s, testament to the successful modifications made after Exercise Dracula revealed its flaws. The tank saw actual combat again in Korea with the 7th Royal Tank Regiment and 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars. During that conflict, British forces deployed Cromwells alongside the more modern Centurion tanks that were beginning to enter service. The tank was also provided to numerous Allied nations rebuilding their armed forces after the war. Australia, Austria, Finland, Israel, Jordan, and other nations operated Cromwells in various capacities. Some Cromwells were later extensively upgraded with more powerful 20-pounder guns, creating the charioteer tank destroyer that served as a useful stopgap until the Centurion tank fully equipped British armored units in the late 1950s. The Cromwell's extended post-war service testified convincingly to the ultimate success of the modifications implemented after Exercise Dracula exposed its reliability problems. The tank that had thoroughly embarrassed Britain in August 1943 became reliable enough for continued frontline service more than a decade later. The Sherman, meanwhile, fought effectively in virtually every theater of World War II, from North Africa through Italy, across northwest Europe, throughout the Pacific Island campaigns, and in China. After the war ended, it continued serving in the armies of dozens of nations through the Korean War, where it proved adequate against Soviet-supplied T-34-85s. It fought in multiple Arab-Israeli wars where both sides operated Shermans supplied by different sources. It saw action in Indo-Pakistani wars where its reliability proved decisive. The tank participated in other regional conflicts throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. Israel became perhaps the most enthusiastic post-war Sherman operator, extensively modifying the design with new engines, improved armor, and powerful guns. Israeli-modified Shermans fought effectively in the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, proving the basic design remained viable decades after introduction. The last Sherman-equipped Chilean Army units finally retired only in 2003, 61 years after the tank entered production, making it one of the longest-serving tank designs in military history. This remarkable longevity testified convincingly to the fundamental soundness of the basic design and the enduring value of reliability-focused engineering over pursuit of cutting-edge performance. Exercise Dracula's lessons extended far beyond narrow questions of tank design to influence broader military procurement philosophy. The test demonstrated comprehensively that cutting-edge theoretical performance means absolutely nothing without underlying reliability to make that performance available when needed. Complexity pursued for its own sake or to achieve marginally better specifications is fundamentally a liability rather than an asset. The ability to mass-produce equipment efficiently and maintain it easily under field conditions matters more than technical sophistication that requires specialized support. These hard-learned lessons influenced post-war British defence procurement philosophy, though unfortunately not always successfully. The persistent desire for technological supremacy and cutting-edge capabilities often still trumped practical considerations of reliability and maintainability, leading to numerous expensive programs that produced small numbers of sophisticated but problematic equipment that never achieved its intended impact. The Exercise Dracula test also revealed starkly the enormous industrial gulf that had opened between American and British manufacturing capability by 1943. American factories had thoroughly mastered mass production techniques first pioneered by Henry Ford in automobile manufacturing and refined through Depression-era industrial programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority. Quality control processes, component standardization, and assembly line efficiency had reached levels that British industry, despite its proud traditions, simply could not match with existing facilities and methods. The Sherman succeeded partly through superior design philosophy, but equally through superior industrial execution that could build truly reliable tanks in overwhelming quantities, while Britain struggled to produce even its problematic designs in adequate numbers for military needs. Industrial production capacity mattered as much as engineering design excellence, perhaps more so, in total war. The human element of Exercise Dracula deserves particular emphasis because it illustrated truths about soldier psychology that transcend specific equipment. Tank crews fundamentally did not care about impressive theoretical performance specifications listed in technical manuals. They cared intensely and practically about whether their tank started reliably in the morning, ran consistently all day without drama, and brought them home safely in the evening. A crew whose tank constantly broke down during operations developed an understandably fatalistic attitude that directly affected their combat effectiveness and willingness to take necessary tactical risks. A crew genuinely confident in their vehicle's reliability fought much more aggressively and effectively, knowing their tank would not fail them at the critical moment. Exercise Dracula demonstrated empirically that reliability affected unit morale and combat effectiveness in profound ways that extended far beyond simple mechanical availability statistics. Trusted vehicles created confident, aggressive, effective crews who accomplished their missions. Unreliable vehicles created anxious, hesitant crews who worried more about breakdowns than enemies, fundamentally undermining combat effectiveness. The final official accounting of Exercise Dracula came in the comprehensive, most secret report filed in late September 1943. The lengthy document circulated among the most senior British military and political leaders, including Winston Churchill, forcing uncomfortable acknowledgement of serious deficiencies in British tank development programs that had consumed vast resources. The report's detailed recommendations directly shaped British procurement policy for the remainder of the war. Development of the Comet tank, which would finally give Britain a cruiser tank genuinely comparable to the German Panther, received substantially increased priority and resources. The report also heavily influenced the strategic decision to continue relying primarily on Sherman tanks rather than attempting to immediately replace them with Cromwells that still required further development. Despite modifications, the stark numbers that emerged from Exercise Dracula were brutal but completely unambiguous. Tank type, total miles covered, total defects, total maintenance hours, hours per mile. Sherman M4A2, 3 tanks, 13,986, 199, 420, 0.03. Sherman M4A4, 3 tanks, comparable. Cromwell, 5 tanks, 11,582, 367, 814, 0.07. Centaur, 3 tanks, 8,492, 297, 742, 0.087. These dry statistical figures translated directly into operational realities that determine victory or defeat in actual campaigns. They meant concretely that Sherman-equipped units could advance significantly farther per day and fight more effectively than Cromwell-equipped units covering the same distance. They meant unambiguously that American engineering philosophy of reliable simplicity had decisively beaten British pursuit of sophisticated speed in the hard test of sustained operations. The story of Exercise Dracula is ultimately about the fundamental difference between impressive theory and harsh practice in warfare. In abstract theory on paper, the Cromwell appeared superior to the Sherman in speed with comparable firepower and armor protection. In brutal practice under realistic conditions, the Cromwell spent more than twice as much time being repaired and correspondingly less time actually fighting. Theory insisted that technical sophistication and cutting-edge performance would inevitably triumph. Practice demonstrated conclusively that unglamorous reliability and simple robustness won battles when equipment had to function far from rear area support. The 2,000-mile test revealed definitively which design philosophy actually worked when tanks had to operate far from comfortable depots under continuous operational stress and demanding combat conditions without the luxury of extensive maintenance time. Modern military forces worldwide still grapple regularly with the core lessons of Exercise Dracula 8 decades later. The seductive temptation remains powerful to pursue cutting-edge performance and impressive specifications at the inevitable expense of boring reliability. Major weapons programs often prioritize sophisticated capabilities that look impressive in presentations over robust dependability that matters in sustained operations. The result is frequently small numbers of extraordinarily expensive, high-maintenance equipment that consistently underperforms less sophisticated but more reliable alternatives in actual service. The Sherman versus Cromwell comparison offers an enduring cautionary tale about the real costs of emphasizing theoretical performance over practical reliability in military equipment procurement. The British soldiers who personally participated in Exercise Dracula returned to their regular units with dramatically new perspectives on their equipment. Sherman crews felt thoroughly vindicated in their long-standing preference for American reliability over British speed and sophistication. Cromwell crews energetically pushed for the comprehensive modifications that would eventually make their tanks genuinely serviceable for combat. Centaur crews expressed considerable relief when informed officially that their problematic tanks would not be sent into combat against German armor. All of them understood clearly that they had witnessed something genuinely significant, a definitive test that proved beyond any doubt that reliability mattered more than any other single characteristic in armored vehicles. Major General Richardson's final words in the comprehensive Exercise Dracula report deserve remembering and repeating. It is evident that the commander of a unit equipped with Shermans can be genuinely confident of taking 99% of his vehicles into battle, at least during their first 2,000 miles of operational life. On the other hand, if he were equipped with Cromwells or Centaurs, he would be in a continuous state of anxiety about whether enough tanks would actually reach the battlefield to carry out the normal tasks expected of his unit. This sober assessment, based on objective data from the most comprehensive test conducted, explained convincingly why British armoured divisions continued relying heavily on American-supplied tanks even after improved British designs became theoretically available. Reliability was not merely desirable or convenient. It was absolutely essential to military effectiveness. The improved Cromwell that eventually emerged from Exercise Dracula and subsequent intensive modifications became a genuinely capable tank for its intended reconnaissance role. The improvements made reliability acceptable for sustained operations, if not quite matching Sherman standards in every metric. The tank served effectively in its intended specialized role as a fast reconnaissance vehicle, exploiting tactical opportunities. But it never replaced the Sherman as Britain's primary cruiser tank because the necessary modifications came far too late and production numbers remained too limited compared to Sherman availability. The opportunity to equip British armoured divisions entirely with domestically produced tanks had passed irretrievably. The Americans had built what was ultimately a better tank, not through superior individual engineering cleverness, but through fundamentally superior industrial philosophy that prioritized reliability. The profound contrast between American and British tank development approaches during World War II reflected much broader underlying differences in industrial culture and national priorities. American industry wholeheartedly embraced mass production philosophy, aggressive standardization, and reliability engineering as core principles. British industry maintained traditional craft production traditions that emphasized bespoke quality, individual excellence, and cutting-edge performance in each unit produced. For luxury consumer goods in peacetime markets, the British approach consistently produced excellence and commanded premium prices. For military equipment that absolutely had to work reliably under the worst possible conditions imaginable, the American approach proved decisively and comprehensively superior. The Sherman beat the Cromwell not in impressive specifications or theoretical performance, but in the muddy fields where reliability alone determined whether tanks fought or failed. Exercise Dracula stands as one of the most important but surprisingly least known comparative tests in modern military history. It provided genuinely objective data comparing major Allied tank designs under carefully controlled but realistic conditions. It forced painful but necessary British acknowledgement of serious systematic deficiencies in tank development programs. It directly influenced critical procurement decisions that materially affected the course of the war in Northwest Europe. And it demonstrated an essential truth that military establishments still struggle to fully accept: reliability matters more than performance specifications. Simplicity consistently beats sophistication. The tank that runs reliably wins decisively over the tank that impresses in technical specifications but fails repeatedly in practice. The 2,000 miles methodically covered during Exercise Dracula revealed, at acceptable cost in time and resources, what actual combat would have proven at vastly higher cost and lives. The Cromwell was simply not ready for frontline service in its August 1943 configuration. The modifications needed considerable time to develop properly and implement correctly across production lines. The Sherman, already thoroughly battle-tested in North Africa, Sicily, and increasingly in Italy, could be trusted absolutely to perform under sustained operational stress. The choice facing British commanders was never really whether they personally preferred British or American tanks. It was whether they wanted tanks that worked consistently or tanks that broke down repeatedly. The comprehensive test made that choice completely obvious to anyone willing to honestly examine the data. Looking back from our present perspective, more than 80 years after Exercise Dracula, the test offers lessons about military procurement that remain powerfully relevant. It demonstrates convincingly the critical importance of realistic testing under actual operational conditions rather than relying primarily on theoretical performance figures from controlled trials. It proves that reliability engineering deserves priority equal to or greater than performance engineering in weapon system development. It shows that fundamental industrial philosophy matters as much as individual design excellence. And it reminds us that the most important characteristic of any military equipment is simply that it works when desperately needed, not how impressive it looks in glossy specification sheets or promotional presentations. The Sherman tank that completed 2,000 miles with minimal maintenance during Exercise Dracula went on to fight across Europe, making vital contributions to Allied victory. The Cromwell that required more than twice as much maintenance underwent many months of intensive modifications before becoming genuinely serviceable for combat operations. The Centaur that performed worst of all was relegated to training roles and specialized conversions. These dramatically different outcomes were determined not by the courage or skill of crews, not by the good intentions of designers, and not by the theoretical sophistication of engineering. They were determined fundamentally by reliability, the decidedly unglamorous quality that matters most when complex machines must work under sustained stress. Exercise Dracula answered decisively a question that British commanders desperately needed answered: could the Cromwell replace the Sherman as Britain's primary cruiser tank? The comprehensive test provided a clear, unambiguous, data-driven answer: no, not yet. Not until extensive modifications substantially improved reliability to genuinely acceptable levels for sustained combat operations. That honest answer directly influenced British armor doctrine for the remainder of the war and shaped post-war tank development philosophy for decades. It was an expensive lesson in both time and resources, but one learned through systematic testing rather than preventable combat casualties. The 2,000 miles of Exercise Dracula ultimately saved British lives by preventing premature deployment of unreliable tanks that would have failed catastrophically when most desperately needed. The final irony of Exercise Dracula is that it revealed decisive American superiority in precisely the specific area where Britain had long prided itself most. British engineering was famous worldwide for exceptional quality and technical sophistication. British industry had originally led the global industrial revolution in the 19th century. British wartime innovation had produced radar, operational jet engines, and countless other advanced technologies. Yet, American industry, with its relentless emphasis on reliability and efficient mass production over traditional craftsmanship and sophisticated performance, built fundamentally better tanks. The Sherman succeeded not through British-style engineering excellence, but through American-style industrial efficiency and practical philosophy. The lesson was deeply humbling for British pride, but absolutely necessary for military effectiveness. In the end, Exercise Dracula was about far more than comparing tanks. It was about competing philosophies of engineering and manufacturing. It was about the critical difference between what looks impressively good on paper and what actually works in harsh practice. It was about the genuine military value of unglamorous reliability versus the seductive appeal of exciting performance. The test showed conclusively that in warfare, as in life generally, simply getting there matters more than getting there impressively fast. The Sherman got there consistently. The Cromwell too often did not. That fundamental difference made all the difference between victory and defeat.